Good morning. I'm Kerry Woods. I teach ecology and evolution at Bennington, and I'm going to be your talking head for today. So we tend, all of us, to assess new things through the lenses and ideas we're most familiar with, which means we're all intellectual provincials. But I am going to argue that disease, and in particular COVID-19, is an ecological and evolutionary phenomenon. And in order to really understand and manage it well, we need to take that perspective. So the slideshow that I'm going to be showing along with this covers most of my points. If you need to pause the talk to absorb a slide more fully, you should do that. So in what way is disease an ecological phenomenon? Well, fundamentally what a disease is the symptoms in a host that are induced by the presence of an infectious agent or a pathogen. Is not the infectious agent, the germ is not the disease, but an interaction between organisms of two species. That in itself makes us, means we're looking at an ecological phenomenon. And in fact, there is a relatively new discipline called disease ecology, which begins here and is very trendy, by the way. If you want to get a job as an ecologist, being a disease ecologist is one of the best ways to do so. So the first question a disease ecologist might ask, the first of several, is where do these relationships originate? Where does a new infectious disease or an emerging disease come from? And there are generally two sources. One of them is that there might be some creature that's living inside of you now that becomes more virulent. Virulence is just a term we use to describe how sick a parasite makes you, an internal parasite makes you. So old internal parasites may become disease-causing. The other possibility is that the disease organism, the parasite or pathogen, makes a host jump, comes from some other organism into humans, and the disease originates that way. Now, the first possibility is not at all far-fetched because we are, in fact, a very complex community of thousands of species of microorganisms. In fact, your body contains trillions of cells of things that aren't you, about 10 times as many cells of bacteria and other parasites and mutualists as of your own. Occasionally, some of these resident organisms make a strange transition from being innocuous to being pathogenic. We have lots of resident viruses too. Some of them, in fact, have been embedded in our own genomes for millions of years and evolutionarily co-opted for our own uses. We call these endogenous retroviruses, and they can, under the right circumstances, break free from our own enslavement of them and become disease organisms. None of these, however, are the reason of the origin of COVID-19. COVID-19 is a good example of what we call a zoonotic or disease or a zoonosis. And that's where most new emergent diseases come from. Generally, these happen all the time. There are probably several events each year around the world where a bacterium or virus makes a host jump, makes some people sick. It's only occasionally, however, that these events spread to become epidemics or pandemics. So what are the conditions that favor a host jump, and what makes a host jump turn into an epidemic disease? Well, in order for the disease to become epidemic or pandemic, the host the parasite, once it jumps to the new human host, has to not just live there and potentially make the host sick, but it has to have the capacity to move from one human host to another. In other words, there has to be human-to-human transmission, and it has to be frequent enough to cause the disease to spread. And we will come back to that. That's effectively what immunology or epidemiology is about. We are quite sure that COVID-19 is a zoonotic disease. The coronavirus that causes it derives from, we are now pretty certain, a strain of coronaviruses that is native to a species of bat that lives in South Asia. Bats are a reservoir of many species of coronavirus, but the most closely related coronavirus found in the wild so far is in a bat. There is good genetic evidence that there was probably some other host in between bats and humans. In other words, two host jumps are involved. The secondary or intermediate host, we don't know for sure. Some people think it was pangolins, others think it was one of two or three other candidates. So this is one of the many things that we still don't fully understand about the new coronavirus. Previous coronaviruses have certainly jumped to human hosts from bats, but also from other hosts like camels. So one of the important messages of disease ecology is that changing ecological conditions can influence the likelihood of host shifts. In other words, the origin of new diseases is itself an evolutionary or an ecological phenomenon. What kinds of ecological changes? Well, anything that increases the likelihood of close contact between an animal host and a human host. And that would include things like land use change and human settlement in or near previously isolated habitats. That's probably one of the things that has led to the Lyme disease epidemic in the northeastern US. Another is human trade and consumption of wild animals. The increasing trade in bushmeat or wild meat is globally important. In some areas, it's a matter of subsistence. In other areas, it's luxury consumption. We know, for instance, that both bats and pangolins are sold in the so-called wet markets of South Asia. Pangolins have become a luxury food. People will pay lots of money to have a pangolin served to them in a restaurant, which has led to their becoming rather endangered in the wild, but it also means people handle pangolins a lot now. So the opportunity for a host shift by the coronavirus to humans has certainly been amplified by these kinds of processes. Certainly, changes in habitat globally have led to and will continue to lead to an accelerated rate of host shifts of pathogens from wild animals to humans, and COVID-19 is not the first or the last new disease that will arise from this. Okay, a second way in which we look at disease as an ecological phenomenon is to address the question of what conditions will allow a new disease to actually become an epidemic or a pandemic. So this picture shows you a very, very simple version of a basic epidemiological model. And Katie Montavan will spend some more time with this kind of thinking later. Epidemiological models, though, take the host population, which is us in this case, and basically breaks it out into several compartments, groups. You belong to one of these three groups in this simple model. You're either an individual that is susceptible to the disease, and at the beginning of a disease outbreak, that includes all of us. You're an individual who has the pathogen and is capable of spreading it, or you have recovered from the disease or potentially died from the disease. In either case, the epidemiological model assumes that you are now no longer a susceptible individual, you are resistant. Okay, so here are the key things about epidemiologists wonder about. What's the likelihood of transmission from a susceptible individual of a disease organism to an infectious individual? And what's the rate at which infectious individuals leave the infectious class through recovery or death? Beta here is a term that refers to how easily a pathogen is spread. And this little Greek letter, what is that, a lambda? I don't know. Anyway, this This coefficient is the rate at which individuals leave the infectious pool. So the critical thing from an epidemiological viewpoint is this. Does an infectious individual infect, on average, more than one susceptible individual before it leaves the infectious pool? If it does, then the disease will persist in the host population. If it's more than one, the disease will spread. If it's a lot more than one, then you have an epidemic condition. We call that rate the number of new hosts that are infected by the pathogen from a given individual, infectious individual on average, R, or R sub 0. R sub 0 actually refers to the rate when everybody's susceptible. So we all have been hearing this because one of the big questions about COVID is what R is. And we don't know for sure because so many people who are infected apparently don't show symptoms and are never diagnosed. So that makes it very difficult to know what the actual epidemiological parameters are. Here are some R sub 0s for other diseases. Extremely contagious diseases like measles or pertussis, which is whooping cough, can normally in a generally susceptible population see one infected individual infecting as many as 15 or more other individuals. That leads to explosive spread. Rates like 5 or 6, which are in many familiar old crowd diseases, are also quite capable of producing epidemics. And we suspect that COVID R sub 0 is somewhere in that range. So once a population of hosts moves through, enough of the individuals in that population of hosts moves through the infectious category into the resistant or recovered category, the rate of spread will slow because simply there are fewer susceptibles contacting infectious individuals. If it reaches a high enough proportion in this category, then infectious individuals will no longer infect more than one individual, additional individual. And at that point, the disease dies out. The percentage of the host population which is immune to the disease, at which the disease dies out because R sub 0 is now below 1, is what we refer to as the herd immunity level, another term we've all been hearing. For most of these diseases, the herd immunization rate is somewhere on the order of 80+%. If that's true for COVID as well, then we have a long ways to go. And I'll leave the rest of the epidemiological modeling to Katie. This just repeats what I've already said, but you're welcome to examine it. One question that remains for COVID, though coronavirus caused COVID, is whether or not individuals who've recovered from the disease are in fact permanently immune. Most people who study this think they probably are, at least for some time, but it's not well understood. Okay, another point, another question that's central to disease ecology is this. Why do pathogens even make us sick in the first place? We know that humans are hosts of many, many other kinds of organisms internally, but most of them don't make us sick. So why do some of them become pathogens and make us sick? Well, the simplest answer is this. A pathogen, an organism that lives inside you, is using resources that you would otherwise have available for your own use. So a pathogen population that grows too large or too rapidly will compete with its host for resources that are critical to the host's well-being. Now, that's simple ecology, but it isn't adequate because it would only explain symptoms like fatigue or weakness with long-term infections, a general loss of function. It doesn't speak to things like fever or coughs or sneezes or diarrhea or things like that. So we also see that some of our symptoms are the result of a different aspect of the interaction between pathogen and host. That is, they are results of our own immune response. Most pathogens can live only in a relatively narrow range of environmental conditions. Your insides are a very stable environment. If you change the conditions of that environment by much, it can disfavor the pathogen, the parasite. One of the best and easiest ways to change the conditions unfavorably for a parasite is to change temperature. So human and other organisms, this is pretty much universal to animals, will do things to alter their body temperature in response to an infection as an immune response. And it can be quite effective. It can also, however, unfortunately, damage your own system because we also require a quite constant internal temperature to function well. And under some conditions, our control mechanisms get so out of whack that the fever can get out of hand and become lethal. Nonetheless, many of our disease symptoms are actually not caused directly by the disease, but they are caused by our own system's response to the disease. Finally, a number of the symptoms are actually a result of pathogens manipulating host physiology in ways that benefit them. The most important way in which a pathogen, or the most commonly understood way in which a pathogen can benefit itself by changing something about your own phenotype or physiology, is by doing things to make you more likely to transmit the pathogen to a new host. There are a lot of cases of this. Cholera is one of the best known in human cases. Cholera kills you by causing massive diarrhea and lethal dehydration. But in the course of losing all those fluids, your body is shedding millions and billions of cholera bacteria. And if the water supply is not well protected, you're contaminating the water supply that is going to be drunk by other hosts and therefore infecting many other people. As soon as water supplies become well sanitized and protected and safe, then the cholera threat basically disappears. Mosquitoes, actually, it turns out that mosquitoes are especially attracted to people with malaria. Why? Well, apparently the malaria parasite induces some change in your body chemistry that will cause this. And of course, as you probably know, mosquitoes are the alternate host and vector for the malaria parasite. So malaria can make you very sick indeed, but as long as a mosquito can find you, it does not necessarily reduce the likelihood of the parasite being transmitted to a new host. The little fish at the bottom is kind of a dramatic example. This is a fish that's normally kind of olive drab in color. It is nocturnal, and it swims around at the bottom of bodies of water. When it is infected by a particular parasite, it turns red, starts swimming around during the day at the surface of the water, where it's likely to be eaten by a bird, which is the alternate host and transmitter or vector of the pathogen, the parasite. So there are some really complex and bizarre scenarios here, but COVID is much simpler. COVID makes you cough, and coughing is one of the most likely ways in which a coronavirus is spread to a new host. We are now quite pretty convinced that almost all COVID cases are through airborne transmission through small droplets of moisture, and sneezing and coughing are the best way those can be propelled and suspended in the air for a new host to breathe in. So these phenotypic traits that are actually caused by the pathogen, in order to enhance their own transmission, are often referred to as an example of an extended phenotype. They're actually part of the genetic expression of the pathogen, but the genetic expression of the pathogen is manifest in another organism, the host. Okay. But there's a problem for pathogens making their host sick, a trade-off, if you will. So if a pathogen makes you too sick, and let's think about coronavirus, if coronavirus makes you sick enough that you are bedridden and you spend all your day lying in bed, you may be coughing out lots and lots of virus particles, but the odds of them finding their way to a new host are much reduced compared to if you were walking around out in the open, coughing and sneezing on other people. In other words, if the virulence is too high, if a pathogen is too virulent, and a host is incapacitated, and host incapacity reduces transmission, then that virus runs the risk of killing its host, or its host recovering, its host immune system winning, before it infects enough new hosts to maintain the disease in the host population. So this is kind of an adaptive trade-off, a tension. A host, or a pathogen rather, has a kind of an optimal virulence where it causes you to become just sick enough to enhance its own transmission and persistence. But if it becomes too virulent, and it may actually decrease the likelihood of being transmitted. So this is where we make a jump to an evolutionary perspective. Before we do that, remember that COVID is a good example. COVID as a disease appears often to not cause severe symptoms, even detectable symptoms, and yet the host may still be infectious. So that's a good example of a pathogen that has really discovered a pretty good extended phenotype. It's able to foster its own transmission in a way that doesn't cause you to become too sick to travel out in the world. Okay, so but now I want to make a step from here to make the point that infectious disease is not just an ecological phenomenon, but it's shaped in ways that we must understand by evolution, by natural selection, in order to, and we need to understand this in order to manage it well. So let's consider what we just talked about what the consequences of virulence might be, positive and negative, for a pathogen. So the optimal virulence for pathogen, and I'll come back to what optimal means, is where the enhanced transmission due to the pathogen's symptoms in its host is maximized compared to the penalties, the reduced transmission due to incapacitation of the host. If transmission is really easy, even if you make your host really sick, there's no real penalty. So in cases like malaria, where the mosquito can find you even if you're in bed, or in cholera, where there's no good sewage treatment, there's no real penalty to incapacitating your host. You're still transmitted. But that's not the case in diseases that are transmitted through the air, in water droplets. You've got to keep your host moving around in the world, or you lose. So we've already answered this question about what drives pathogens to become more or less virulent in a rather crude way. We need to go a little more deeper into the framework of selective evolution and refine our language a little more precisely in order to have a clearer sense, a clearer understanding of this. So the question, let's rephrase the question: when will a pathogen become more virulent by evolutionary change? Imagine a pathogen population in which there's one variation, a mutant, if you will, that's a little more virulent. And that slightly more virulent version causes symptoms that enhance transmission. Then that in a more virulent version will infect a larger and larger proportion of the susceptible host population. And the less virulent, less transmitted version will dwindle away until it's actually lost because the hosts recover or die before transmitting it. Okay, so if a mutation favors virulence that enhances transmission, it spreads. If, on the other hand, a mutation causes yet higher virulence, a further mutation, and that further mutation debilitates the host to the point where they don't get out in the world and spread, then that mutation will tend to be transmitted to fewer hosts, and that form of the virus will tend to diminish until it's gone. So we just invented natural selection as it acts on a pathogen like a virus. Read this definition by Darwin and you'll see how similar it is to what we just said. If variations useful to any organic being do occur, assuredly individuals thus characterized will have the best chance of being preserved in the struggle for life, and from the strong principle of inheritance, they will tend to produce offspring similarly characterized, and so forth. Okay. So to help think about the power of this model, think about what I've already mentioned, that if malaria makes you really sick, it means that there is a lot of the pathogen, the parasite, circulating in your blood system, and any mosquito that bites you is likely to pick up the parasite and spread it. Well, even though it's making you very sick, there's really still no selective penalty, because even though you're very sick and in bed, the mosquito can fly to you. So pathogens that are transmitted easily without human-to-human contact tend to become extremely virulent. And pathogens that are not transmitted easily tend to see reduced virulence. Here's a famous case of cholera, and we'll look at one graph closely here. Here are cholera strains of cholera bacteria collected from various parts of the Western Hemisphere. And what we're looking at on the horizontal axis is the access of the population of humans to potable water, meaning safe water. And what we're looking at on the vertical axis is the toxigenicity, which is another way of saying intensity of pathogenic activity of the cholera bacteria. And what you see is that in areas which have well-treated water supplies, like Louisiana and Texas, the cholera bacteria exists, but it has virtually no pathogenicity. In areas where water supplies are not well protected, the cholera bacterium is quite pathogenic. So this is the evolution of emerging pathogens, another big area of study if you're interested. But let's move back to what this implies for COVID and coronavirus. Can we manage the action of natural selection on pathogens to actually make them less virulent? And the answer to that is yes. The logic we just went through says very simply that if we can reduce the likelihood of transmission, selection will favor lower transmission or lower virulence. How do we reduce the likelihood of transmission in the case of COVID? That's pretty straightforward. We know the answer to that. We maintain social distancing and we wear masks and so forth. In other words, far-sighted public health policy can target not just immediate protection of the population, but evolutionary reduction of disease virulence by targeting reduction of transmission rates. We know that there's a lot of genetic variability among coronaviruses. From our genetic analyses, we've used that to track their spread around the world. What we don't know really yet is whether these different strains vary a lot in virulence. It will be interesting to find out if that's the case. Okay, one more point I want to make. So COVID-19 as a disease and coronavirus, the novel coronavirus, a pathogen, are likely around to stay. We're not going to eliminate them from the human population in all likelihood. But if we can manage it properly, mainly by reducing transmission rates, then it becomes less and less of a health threat. So for now, that means distancing and masks, and the benefits of that go well beyond protecting yourself, which they do, protecting vulnerable individuals like old ecology teachers. They include actually the long-term reduction of the actual pathogenicity, disease-causing potential of the virus. We need, as soon as possible, to promote lots and lots of testing to allow us to identify cases and track chains of transmission, to enhance and target quarantines for the same reasons. And eventually, a vaccine will allow us to reduce the pool of susceptibles, and as we saw in the epidemiological models, that reduces transmission rates, and will again select for reduced pathogenicity. So wear your mask, especially if you need to get closer than 2 meters or so to other people, and especially if you need to do that inside, because it has these multiple benefits. And we'll learn more about COVID in the next few months, but for right now, that's what I have to say, so thanks.